Welcome to the Enlightenment Workshop, Oxford's interdisciplinary seminar in 18th century intellectual history and literary culture. My name is Avi Lifschitz. I teach European history at Magdalen College, Oxford, although right now I am in Berlin, Germany for research leave. I convened the seminar with my colleague Nicholas Cronk, director of the Voltaire Foundation at Oxford. I hope you can see him on the screen. Nicholas will chair some of the next sessions of the Enlightenment Workshop. And although the Enlightenment Workshop has been running for some 30 years now, this is the very first session that is live streamed online on YouTube. And we're very glad to welcome you all, especially those of you who have not yet had the opportunity to join us physically in Oxford in the past. We are also delighted that this first session is dedicated to the new magnum opus of a dear colleague who has always been a pillar of the Enlightenment Workshop. I'm talking about, of course, Ritchie Robertson, the author of the substantial new book, The Enlightenment, The Pursuit of Happiness, 1680 to 1790. Ritchie is Schwarz-Taylor Professor of German Literature and Language at Oxford, and the fact that this book was written by a literary scholar and an expert on Germany will, I think, be mentioned in the discussion. We shall start with a few comments on the book by three colleagues, Joanna Innes, Karen O'Brien, and Anthony Lavopa. Ritchie Robertson will then reply before we open up the discussion to questions from the audience. And you can all type the question into your YouTube chat that you probably see on your screen. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first discussant. Joanna Innes is Professor Emerita of Modern History at Oxford. She has written widely on politics, on society, on ideas in Britain and in Europe, mostly in the 18th and the 19th centuries. Among her many publications are Inferior Politics, Social Problems and Social Policies in 18th Century Britain, 2009, and together with Mark Philp, more recently, two fascinating edited volumes, Imagining Democracy in the Age of Revolutions, 2015, and Imagining Democracy in the Mediterranean, 2018. So Joanna, the floor is now yours.
Well, thank you, Avi, and thank you, Ritchie, for being the occasion of this meeting. So 10 minutes isn't very long. I plan first to characterize the book, then to identify what I see as its strengths and weaknesses, and finally to comment on a few topics on which I have views arising from my own research. I think one might call Ritchie Robertson's book a reader's guide to the Enlightenment. A significant part of the book consists of brief 2 to 4 page outlines of specific books. And tellingly, all the illustrations show the title pages of books. But of course, there's more to the book than that, lots of context or accounts which these detailed descriptions illustrate. But these book summaries are important and distinguishing features of this book. Ritchie's primary object, emphasized especially in the conclusion, seems to be to challenge overly schematic notions of an Enlightenment project, and instead to give the reader a feel for the texture of the thought of the time, to emphasize its diversity, its creativity, and its intellectual seriousness. It follows that this is almost entirely a book about ideas. We hear a little bit about the infrastructure of intellectual life, about universities, academies, salons, and periodicals. There's a chapter inspired by Venturi, he tells us, on what governments did, a discussion of supposedly enlightened rulers, and a brief account of some features of the American and French revolutions. But these are not the book's main concern. Spatially, this is mainly a book about what English and German usage Ritchie calls enlighteners, Aufklärer, in 3 language regions, Britain, France, and Germany, with some attention to Italy. Given the book's method, this may have something to do with Ritchie's language range. We only occasionally hear about characters from the Netherlands, and Spain seems almost entirely absent. Other European places, Greece, Russia, Dalmatia, Finland, make cameo appearances, but we don't similarly hear from their thinkers. And we hear about a wider world, China, Tahiti, the Caribbean, only in terms of how Europeans thought about these places. The book is strongly thematic. After an introduction, each of the remaining 13 chapters focus on something that people thought about. Depending on how Ritchie wants to frame that topic, he may go back in time to the early 17th century for the scientific revolution, or to the Reformation or humanism. He much more rarely goes forward in time, and then not usually very programmatically, more a case of giving us a glimpse of how some line of thought might carry forward. Quite often, accounts end, appropriately enough, I think, with Kant dissenting from some train of thought. The subtitle, The Pursuit of Happiness, gives us his overarching view of what this was all about. It's recognized that some people continue to prioritize happiness in the next life, but enlighteners, as they're presented to us, were more often more concerned with happiness in this. We're repeatedly told about change and development in thought. Two recurrent accounts are offered to organize our thinking about change. Cartesianism is said to give way to Newtonianism, broadly deductive to inductive ways of thinking, though Ritchie doesn't foreground those terms, and indeed suggests that both modes of thought had more to them than that. And secondly, not entirely mapping onto that, the main shift comes a bit later, from a model which stresses the importance of human reason to one which stresses the importance of human emotions, which reason may do little more than rationalize. So what are the book's strengths? I think Ritchie's approach to humanizing the Enlightenment, letting us hear its voices, is effective. Within its geographical limits, the book is extremely wide-ranging. Quietly magisterial in tone, it nonetheless comes across very clearly as the work of a single author thinking his way through the topic and forming his own views, and this gives it a certain freshness and immediacy. This tone of personal inquiry relieves what might otherwise seem its almost encyclopedic quality. Though the book has connecting themes, by and large the individual chapters could be read individually, and many of them provide excellent introductions to topics. So I would have found it a useful starting point to have available to me a few years ago when I was trying to read up on 17th and 18th century ideas about emotions. I know almost nothing about aesthetics, a topic which, as Ritchie notes, is often ignored by writers on the Enlightenment, so I learned a lot from the chapter about that. As one might expect, it's relatively strong on German writers who are presented, contrary to some subsequent accounts, as very much part of the Enlightenment conversation. So what are the book's limitations? I see two that I think are quite important. This is very much a trees book and not a wood book. Ritchie is just not very interested in the question that has agitated lots of historians for decades about whether Enlightenment is a useful category, what different senses we might give to it, and what entitles us to characterize one or another thing as enlightened. So if that question interests you, you'll be given raw material to think with, and of course some implicit answers, but you won't find much self-conscious wrestling with these concerns. It's to some extent just a way of writing, but the Enlightenment does get reified here. We're told the Enlightenment thought X or agreed on X. It's very unclear what the substance of these claims is. They implicitly offer a definition of what Enlightenment thought consisted in, as opposed to unenlightened thought? Or do they mean pretty well all writers in the period we call the Enlightenment agreed with this? Or a third possibility, do they mean those that we judge by some other never specified criterion to be enlightened agreed on this? If unclarities like this are going to worry you a lot, you'll find this book disquieting. Personally, I think of the Enlightenment as a heuristic device. It doesn't have one meaning, but we can use the concept to frame a variety of worthwhile agendas and analyses. But I would say we do need to be aware of what we're doing with it at any given moment. If you haven't reached your own conclusions on these issues, I don't think this book will help you much. Of course, that's not uniquely an issue with this book, but given that many authors in recent decades have foregrounded these questions, it's notable that Ritchie backgrounds them. He's also not at all unusual in situating the Enlightenment in its past, but much less in its future, especially not in its immediate future, the early 19th century. I regret this because I've come to think of this as one of the most commonly missed and most badly needed moves to be made in Enlightenment scholarship. I also see a tension between two things the book tells us. One is that the Enlightenment is foundational to our present. Here's a recurrent, if not very energetically probed theme. Yet this is why the topic is important. That seems to be the underlying premise. Yet it was also, as presented to us, a phase in thought which ended, on which, as I've remarked, Kant is often shown to have pulled down the curtain. How do we weld these two perspectives into a single picture? If Ritchie has an answer to the question, what came after Enlightenment, characteristically for a literary scholar, and especially a German literary scholar, this seems to be Romanticism. But what about liberalism? This gets briefly mentioned in the conclusion, but in what ways did early 19th century liberalism, not some abstract construct, but liberalism as actually constructed in the early 19th century, build upon and yet modify Enlightenment legacies? Well, I'm asking the book to answer questions Ritchie isn't trying to answer, but I regret that he's in the mainstream in not doing a bit more with them. So on some more particular themes, and not so much in criticism of the book, as just to try to give the audience alternative perspectives to bring to it, I'd like to finish with three alternative views I'd want to offer in relation to parts of the book that are closest to my own research terrain. These have to do with similarities and differences between British and European states, the concept of happiness, about which I think Karen will say more, and the book's characterization of the French Revolution. In Ritchie's account in the Venturi-inspired chapter, chapter 8, Britain didn't have much of a state by European standards, though it had a vigorous civil society. My esteemed, sadly deceased former colleague Paul Langford would have agreed with him. I don't really agree. I think the British state was not like the French or the Prussian state in terms of the structures through which it operated domestically, but it was nonetheless quite a strong state, as its relative efficacy in bringing criminals to justice, and still more notably, the huge sums it raised and dispensed for the support of the poor suggest. I think it's interesting that whereas we often in this period find commentators, British and foreign, talking about the distinctiveness of Britain's central institutions, no one to my knowledge had a very fleshed out view what might be distinctive about the institutions which government was exercised in the localities, what contemporaries called inferior levels of government. The idea that Britain had a distinctive tradition of local self-government was a mid-19th century invention. It became part of a new liberal ideal of governance. We should be wary of reading 18th century arrangements backwards through that lens. So happiness, here's my 2 pence worth. I think there's more to say about varying and changing conceptions of happiness. The reader might be tempted to suppose something Ritchie doesn't explicitly claim, which is that the happiness the Enlightenment pursued in this period was an emotional state. Well, sometimes it was indeed a rich emotional state, and sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it meant something like welfare with relatively thin emotional content. Ritchie begins to target divisions over this at the end of his discussion of punishment, but doesn't take it further when, given the headline status he gives the concept, perhaps he should have done. The French Revolution. Implicitly, Ritchie treats the terror as the truth and meaning of the French Revolution. That's the way many Brits saw it at the time and for long after. But I think that's a partisan view. To understand how the French Revolution shaped the future, we need also to understand the views of the many who thought that the terror was a troubling episode, but an episode, a derogation from, but not the end, either of the revolution or of the Enlightenment.
Thank you very much, Joanna. And I will now briefly introduce our next discussant, Karen O'Brien, who is head of the Humanities Division and professor of English literature at Oxford. Among her publications are Narratives of Enlightenment, Cosmopolitan History from Voltaire to Gibbon, 1997, and Women and Enlightenment in 18th Century Britain, 2009. Karen has also co-edited a second volume of the Oxford History of the Novel in 2014, and more recently, the Cambridge Companion to Gibbon, 2018, with another Oxford colleague, Brian Young. Karen, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to join this wonderful event, and thank you, Ritchie, for your enormously enlightening and capacious book. And I think where I'm going to start is where Joanna left off, so taking it for granted that this is not a book that profoundly addresses itself to whether there was an enlightenment, and if so, what we should call it. And I have to say, I rather welcome the reprieve from those methodological discussions and the diving in that this book represents. It does instantiate a very broad conception of the Enlightenment, not so much as a set of social practices, but as an intellectual movement, and as Ritchie describes it, a sea change in sensibility, which is why I think he makes such extensive and really groundbreaking use of literary sources alongside an enormous range of other sources, which he demonstrates that he has mastered effortlessly, and why, without too much self-interrogation, he takes a pan-European and transnational view of the Enlightenment. This is also somewhat of an enlightenment from above, an enlightenment that advocates change from above and sometimes engages and is delivered by enlighteners who are concerned with what change they may deliver from a position of authority. But the central claim of the book is that the notion of happiness, Glück, Félicité, bonheur, gave the Enlightenment its intellectual coherence. And taking my departure from Joanna's remarks, I would like to test and explore this assumption that happiness can be a really meaningful organizational frame for the Enlightenment, not an unfamiliar one, but one that I think Ritchie's book represents in a really interesting new way. And one at the end of the book that where Ritchie ends becomes the kind of organizing principle of the American and French revolutions, which are a big part of this story. And these revolutions are depicted as advocating happiness as the goal of society and government. Ritchie's book is concerned with happiness not, I think, just as an emotional state and a subjective state, but as he says, with happiness, with the preconditions for personal happiness, including domestic affection, material sufficiency, and a suitable degree of freedom. But it's also, and I think more importantly, concerned with the way in which the Enlightenment thought about happiness in aggregate. That idea of the aggregation of happiness, social, individual, is one of the great innovations of Enlightenment thinking. So Ritchie asks continually, how in the Enlightenment does public happiness relate to private happiness? And how among some thinkers does the notion of happiness become normative? He cites the Swiss writer Burlamaqui as saying that we have a right to pursue happiness and a right to happiness. Now, the notion that happiness is at the foundation of the Enlightenment is not new. Roy Porter, in his study of the Enlightenment, said that the great question of the Enlightenment was not how can I be saved, but how can I be happy? And latterly, Darren McMahon has written a number of really interesting books and articles on the subject of happiness from the ancient world through the Enlightenment period and beyond, positioning the Enlightenment as a really transformational moment in the understanding of happiness. And of course, the notion of happiness has deep roots in ancient philosophical debate about the relationship between doing well and living well, a debate much elaborated in the 17th and 18th centuries, starting with, and this is one of Avi's edited books, a revival of interest in Epicureanism in the late 17th century, and much complicated in the context of the analysis of commercial society by a renewed new need to demonstrate that living morally or well and being happy amid all these new comforts and products were in fact connected, because for the Enlightenment it's no longer so self-evident that they are connected and that there therefore is an urgent need to do so. And then following Mandeville, and in moral philosophy in particular, the concept of the relationship between doing well and living well is hugely elaborated in agent-centered philosophy concerned with our cognitive capacities for sympathy, the relationship between self-love and social ties, the gendered nature of virtue, and the relationship of virtue to rationality. Following on from Roy Porter, though, I think it's important that in Ritchie's book, this is not merely a pagan debate or a secularizing debate, and Ritchie demonstrates how much this debate about happiness and our entitlement to happiness and how happiness works in aggregate was part of a process within religion itself, and not only the Christian religion as well. So there are some important thoughts there in Ritchie's book about that aspect of happiness. Most interestingly, as Ritchie constantly explains, the focus on happiness as something that gave the Enlightenment its intellectual coherence makes sense only if we understand this in symbiotic relationship with the other major textual developments of the period in literary writing. And Ritchie's book is, as you would expect from a great literary scholar, extraordinarily rich in references to literary writers from Goethe, Lessing and Schiller to Diderot, Rousseau and Richardson. No study since Lynn Hunt's groundbreaking Inventing Human Rights has pulled off such a terrific synthesis of imaginative literature and enlightenment in ways that make the two work meaningfully and symbiotically together through the period of the late 17th to 18th centuries. And I think it's because for here, in the literary stories of pursuits of individual happiness, recognizably in this period grounded in shared and particularized social worlds in narrative, happiness becomes something that people imaginatively allow to others. They acknowledge happiness as an entitlement in others and recognize happiness not as a static state, not as the happy valley of Samuel Johnson's Rasselas, soon rejected by Rasselas himself, but as a process. Moreover, in the many works that demonstrate that virtue will be rewarded with happiness, it is not so much that virtue brings its own inner felicity, rather that the resilient, virtue-asserting character or couple seek to reconfigure the familial and social conditions around them such that happiness adapts to the requirements of virtue. This parallel evolution of literature, especially narrative fiction and Enlightenment, notwithstanding huge differences of preoccupation and outlook, give us, in Ritchie's book, a new typology of Enlightenment happiness, or at least I'm asserting, and Ritchie may disagree with me, that I think implicit in the whole book, there is a new typology of happiness. And borrowing from the political the historians of political thought, I'm going to call this negative happiness and positive happiness. Negative happiness, like the state of nature in some contract theories, relates to the default condition of all human beings to enjoy their human bodies and follow their inclinations free from coercion, free from irrational fears and cruelty. So the default condition is that we may be negatively happy, according to so many Enlightenment thinkers, the overwhelming majority of Enlightenment thinkers. We may be free from torture, we may be free from forced labor, we may be free from slavery, sexual abuse, superstition, economic regulation, mercantilism, that means in some quarters, monopoly in others, a sense of sin in our own desires, religious intolerance, and warfare. And literature in this period gives sympathetic breadth to understand what this freedom from, this happiness, this negative happiness may mean for a far wider group of people than had ever been previously imagined. A group that includes women, servants, ordinary people, poor people, in some cases, but clearly never enough, slaves themselves. This enlightens almost all enlighteners with the exception of Rousseau, this idea that at very least, happiness, negative happiness, is something that we may be entitled to, and that it is not directly related to our own propensity to seek the good moral life, but that it must be rather located in a systemic reduction, within a system, in other words, a systemic reduction of cruelty in all its forms. Within Ritchie's book, I think there's also a profound exploration of the ways in which the Enlightenment repositioned notions of positive happiness, the many forms of self-actualization that we all have that enable people, and some people at least in this period, to take advantages of opportunities for mobility, for upward social self-improvement, and for the dynamic worlds of the 18th centuries in Europe and America. And clearly those opportunities were very far from being available to all. So it appears in literary form in an active notion of developing and actualizing the private self, and that relates to classical notions of liberty, but it is the private self that I'm talking about. And it can also be seen in aesthetics, as Jo mentioned, in an increasing focus, not so much on the aesthetic object itself, but on the pleasure and even morally improving happiness that comes from the consumption of aesthetic works. But above all, as I said earlier, positive happiness is conceived through a lens of aggregation. To quote Adam Smith, who was thinking of many things, but I think also including the Bengal famine, which he so actively deplored, no society can be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. Happiness must be aggregate happiness. The individual happiness must be benchmarked against the aggregate happiness of the society in which he or she lives. And for Ritchie, I think this is why he is so warm and positive about the great number of practical, pragmatic enlighteners in this period who actively sought to promote that aggregate happiness in their own realms. He is very warm on the subject of Turgot and his administrative reforms. He tells the fascinating story, which I truly didn't know, of the Swedish reformer Anders Chydenius, forgive me if I've mispronounced that, who tried and failed to do something about the condition of quasi-serfdom in 18th century Sweden. And he's very enthusiastic about Leopold, Grand Duke of Tuscany, who made or tried to make a considerable difference in his own domain before becoming Habsburg Emperor. He's also clearly and more conventionally very interested in those who sought to promote a science of social happiness through political economy in Galliani, Genovese, Smith, those concerned with how societies may generate a net surplus in their economies and how they position that net surplus as a net surplus in human happiness and aggregate happiness. And he's also interested, perhaps to a lesser extent, in those thinkers who are interested in the ways in political stability achieved through a reduction in militarism and through representative institutions promote the greater happiness of their society. And we think of Gibbon's famous quotation about the age of the Antonines before the decline and fall of the Roman Empire really took hold. I had to quote this, didn't I? Which for Gibbon was perhaps the happiest period in the history of the human race. Small wonder then that in Ritchie's book, Utility and Ethics, the utilitarian turn is never very far over the horizon. Why, for Ritchie, in terms of thinking about how society might be reshaped through Enlightenment practices and ideas, Montesquieu may be less important in his scheme of interpretation than Beccaria and his legal reforms and his notion that legislation is the art of guiding men to their greatest happiness. Small wonder that his Enlightenment blends into the world of Herder and the Herder's concept of humanitate, or that when he's talking about Goethe's concept of tolerance, he points out that for Goethe, tolerance is not a form of negative happiness only, but also a form of positive happiness. Goethe says that tolerance of other people's religious beliefs must not merely be a concession to others, but an active acknowledgement and respect for their forms of belief. So that for me is a very interesting interface. Bentham is a little way over the horizon. He's often mentioned, but Kant becomes, in Ritchie's Enlightenment, a deeply problematic figure. And it's very interesting. I think, Jo, you picked up on this because towards the end of the book, we hear Kant disparaging the happiness of the people of Tahiti as somehow outside of history and not worthy of consideration as full happiness. The Kant who emphasizes the duty of self-mastery above the duty to promote the happiness of others for the legislator. And I'd be interested to know from Ritchie where one is accustomed to thinking of Kant as a certain kind of high watermark of enlightenment, where, reposing Jo's question, where this leads us in the 19th century. What are the components of enlightenment that we should look to in terms of continuity in the 19th century? What changed? How did we get, in Ritchie's words, to a more Victorianized world of duties and constraint rather than a duty to promote one's own happiness, to promote the happiness of others, and to consider aggregate happiness as the most important thing a political economist, a legislator, and an enlightener can deliver. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. And we now move on to the final discussant before we turn to the author of the book. And the final discussant is Tony Lavopa. Tony is Professor Emeritus of History at the State University of North Carolina. And indeed, he kindly joins us today from across the Atlantic. He is in Raleigh, North Carolina, I believe. Tony has published widely, especially on the German Enlightenment, including a major biography of the philosopher Fichte in 2001. More recently, Tony wrote a cross-European account of gendered ideas of intellectual work entitled The Labor of the Mind, Intellect and Gender in Enlightenment Cultures, 2015. Tony, please.
Thank you, Avi. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. So I think I should begin by noting something about the timing of this book. Just over 50 years ago, Peter Gay published his 2-volume history of the Enlightenment, 1969. And I think we should think about all the water that's gone under the bridge since then, in the period from 69 to the period when Ritchie was writing his book. I'll come back to that, but it's a way of putting the book in perspective in terms of its originality. The book is, to me, an empirical triumph. Ritchie has been remarkably successful in encompassing much of this material since 69. And that in itself makes his book quite original. On the level of theory, it's very interesting because one could read this book as old-fashioned and perhaps even contrarian. Just think of what's not there. Habermas is there, but he takes a beating. My favorite part of the meeting is when Ritchie says that Habermas takes the Enlightenment too seriously. Foucault, there's only one mention of one of his books. He doesn't really figure largely in the book at all. Adorno and Horkheimer are pretty well dismissed as writing not about the Enlightenment, but about modernity. Their book is not a book on the Enlightenment at all. Postmodernism, whether one thinks of it in terms of post-structuralism or any of a number of other things, deconstructionism, is simply missing from the book. Ritchie doesn't see any need to bother with it. And perhaps most striking from a historiographical point of view, Ritchie has rejected all of the constructivist research on the scientific revolution that began with Kuhn and has worked through a number of other people, including Chapin. This is quite remarkable, contrarian, I think, perhaps to some extent, but it also clears the way for him to combine his empirical thoroughness with a kind of theoretical structure of his own. Before getting to it, though, I want to mention two things that I think we all would agree on. One is that Ritchie is a master at biographical contextualization. He does it efficiently and with great effect. And then more important to me is that what I will call the dialogical comparison of texts in disagreement. He's brilliant at this. He puts together sometimes virtual arguments that have, in a way that clarifies both texts in a way that otherwise it could not be done. I'm thinking, for example, of his this discussion of this disagreement between Catherine Macaulay and David Hume on English history, of Schiller and Kant on the notion of character, of Herder and Kant on the notion of race. That's a particularly interesting one, I think. And my favorite, a chapter devoted to 3 novels, Richardson's Clarissa, Rousseau's Pour Éloise, and Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. He takes us into each of these books, he cross-references them, he compares them, and this is a tour de force. This is Ritchie, the literary scholar, doing something that is, I think, unprecedented and greatly enriches the book. So, the rest of what I have to say is thematic, but I'm sorry to say, a rather not incoherent but chaotic way. The book is so big that it kind of overwhelms you, or at least I had that. It had that effect on me. I thought, how the hell am I going to say in 10 minutes, what's everything that's in this book? So I've been highly selective. And Ritchie, I believe that I have a right to be selective, given the scale of your achievement. The first thing I want to say that is that the book, in a way, says 3 cheers for the Germans. I spent most of my career as a Germanist and recently began doing French history. And in all honesty, I felt very guilty about it, because I think German history has suffered a neglect in the history of the Enlightenment as a whole that must be corrected. It's a very complicated story that has to do with Francocentrism, above all Francocentrism. I would say a certain Scottish centrism in recent decades. So there's a dismissive view of the German Enlightenment as not terribly important, especially, and rather timid. I think timidity is the most important thing. But the Germans have done this to themselves as well. They've marked out a zone of purity, German purity, embodied above all in Herder and Schiller, and taken them out of the Enlightenment into something called classicism. Now, what Ritchie has done is, among other things, to bring Goethe and Schiller back into the Enlightenment fully, thoroughly. Not their entire careers, but at least up to through the early 1790s. And that's in itself an immense innovation. But he's also given a kind of place in the sun to other German thinkers who I would suspect people working in other national enlightenments might not even recognize their names. They certainly wouldn't know anything about what they did. One is August Ludwig Stützer, who is a professor at Göttingen in the late 18th century. He wrote about everything. He wrote a book on the history of the drinking habits, among other things. He published the Staatsanzeigen, which was arguably one of the 2 or 3 most important periodicals to be published, not just in Germany, but in Europe. Ritchie gives him his due. In contrast to Gay, who gives him 1 mention, and that a very cursory one. But much more important to me is the figure of Christoph Martin Wieland. Wieland is possibly the most neglected great thinker of the Enlightenment. Ritchie says he is an important, attractive, and versatile a writer as Diderot and Lessing. That's quite a statement, but I think it's true. And he's also, I would say, in the realm of political thinking, superior to both Diderot and Lessing. He invented what Ritchie calls the anthropological novel, and there's a wonderful discussion of that invention in his discussion of Wieland's novel, The Story of Agathon, which I highly recommend. It's a tour de force. So, second theme, reason and emotion. This is a big one. One of the overarching arguments of the book is that in the course of the second half of the 18th century, reason, the emotion, interest in, I should say, or concern about emotion, which displaced, pushed a bit to the side, the concern about reason. So the Enlightenment, the notion of the age of reason becomes a misnomer. This is not an original point of view. I think Ritchie would agree. This is the summation of a wide range of scholarship over the last several decades. What Ritchie does is not just to state it, but to demonstrate it. The age of reason, the age of emotion, in the form of sentimentalism, sensibility, and so on. And he does that above all by taking us into literary texts in a way that we can see how emotion is, the issue of emotion is informing them and even and saturating them. I think I would have stated the case a little more strongly, even than Ritchie. I think that in the second half of the 18th century, emotion in the form of sentiment, sensibility, sympathy, not only becomes the dominant theme of the Enlightenment, the people's perception of the difference between reason and emotion and their sense that they have to make a choice between them becomes one of the central tension lines in Enlightenment discourse. I think Ritchie is implying that, but I would have stated it more strongly. So my emphasis would be less on the dominance of one over the other than on the tension between them, which is ceaseless. In order to understand this, well, I'll skip that. I'm running out of time. The other thing that Ritchie had that Gay did not have was several decades of scholarship on religious enlightenment. It just wasn't there in 1969. But in the last couple of decades, that's been a huge development in Enlightenment scholarship. And Ritchie conveys it very well. I was thinking about this yesterday. At the beginning of my career, I was very taken with Meyer Abrams' natural supernaturalism. And it really did inform much of my scholarship. And so when the story of the religious enlightenments, when the religious enlightenments became a subject, I thought, oh, well, that's just, a continuation of Abrams' book. It's not. Abrams defined secularization as the reformulation of our religious ideas now placed on secular premises. That is not what the religious enlightenments are about, as people like David Sorkin and others have shown very, very well. It's not refounding them on religious premises, on secular premises. It's holding fast to certain religious premises and then trying to purify Christianity by ridding it of superstition. There is tenacious belief in the divinity of Christ, in redemption, and so on. The basic teachings of Christianity. Am I out of time? Okay. So I will, I think I'll just say that Ritchie here takes on Mark Seba and his notion of the disenchantment of the world. And I agree with it. Ritchie is right to say, I think, that the term secularization or disenchantment doesn't do justice to what's happened in the modern world. I would take it a step further by saying that he's made too sharp a distinction between what he calls intellectual religion and personal experience, religion as private experience. I think there's a missing zone there. And that zone is the zone of ideas that are theological, but at the same time are part of the normative equipment with which people go through life. I'm thinking about the idea of labor or the calling, the idea of providence, the idea of marriage, any of a number of other things that give meaning to people's life, but are not as disconnected from theological thinking as he seems to want to make them. They're somewhere between Bourdieu's notion of a habitus and what we would call conventional intellectual history. Am I out of time? Done.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Tony. I think we can continue the conversation in the Q&A session, especially if the issue of theology and disenchantment of the world comes up again. But thank you very much for this overview of Ritchie's book. We would also like to remind the audience that you can now start sending in your questions if you like. You can also wait until Ritchie's comments. And you do that by typing them into the YouTube chat channel that you should have on your screen. We now finally have the opportunity to hear from the author himself. Ritchie Robertson has been teaching at Oxford for more than 30 years now. And to say that the range of Ritchie's scholarship is impressive would be an understatement, because Ritchie has published books on Kafka, Heine, Goethe, the early modern mock epic, and Thomas Mann, among very many other topics. But the Enlightenment has always been of profound interest to him. Ritchie edited early in his career co-edited a volume on the Austrian Enlightenment, and more recently a volume on Lessing and the German Enlightenment. And many of his other works start in the 18th century, for example, his famous book on the Jewish question in German literature. Ritchie, the floor is now yours, please.
Thank you very much. Have I successfully unmuted myself? Can you hear me? Yes, good. Well, first of all, thank you very much to the speakers for their generous and also searching and instructive remarks. And I ought to say that it would be very ungrateful of me not to mention how much the book owes to my editor at Penguin, Stuart Profit. Stuart somehow discerned that I had a book inside me waiting to get out. He was quite right. To my own surprise, I'd never have thought of attempting such a book unprompted, but the the book was there, came out, and I actually found it extremely, remarkably easy to write, although at the same time very, very laborious. It wasn't difficult to fit things together. They all fell into place. Stuart gave my manuscript the most minute attention. I've never had anything remotely comparable from an academic press. He was also very clear about what I must include. In fact, near the end, he demanded that I should write half a chapter on the physical sciences in the Enlightenment. This was a tall order for me, so I, to my shame, dropped science at school at the age of 14. But nevertheless, I set to work, and I may say that the late Roy Porter was a great help. Now, what kind of book is it? It is a trees book rather than a wood book. That's how I write and how I think, perhaps to a fault. But there are particular reasons in this case. I wanted to get and convey some idea of what it felt like to live in the Enlightenment. Hence the emphasis on literature and on what are called ego documents, diaries and letters, as well as on biography. And in doing so, it was increasingly borne in upon me that the Enlightenment period is different from what one tends to imagine. I felt it was a period in its own right very, very different from the age in which we now live. So much so that we can only, with great qualifications, call the Enlightenment our ancestor. Think of a period in which nobody thought the Earth could have existed for more than 100,000 years, in which it was taken for granted by the Enlighteners that political reforms must come from the top down, and democracy was looked on with great suspicion. But one thing that particularly struck me was I came across a book by a German emigre in England, John Bruckner, who presented a picture of the natural world as a system in which every creature preys on others, a constant food chain, and takes this as proof of God's benevolence. Now, that is exactly the nature read in Tooth and Claw that Tennyson, 100 years later, cited as an insuperable objection to divine benevolence. But it wasn't a problem to Bruckner. So the difference in the Enlightenment from us is something I wanted to foreground. Now that helps to explain why I didn't attempt to go forward into the 19th century, apart from a couple of references by way of contrast to Wordsworth and George Eliot. Not only would there be too much material for me to wrestle with, and I already had enough, it would also have obliged me to struggle with the question of romanticism, which incidentally I don't believe in. Joe pointed out that I tend to reify the Enlightenment. That's quite true. To work with the concept, you have to take it as something for the time being firm and solid. You can't work with a concept that constantly liquefies in your hands. Romanticism I'm very much more skeptical about. I think that's a later invention. I don't believe there's such a thing except in Germany. But that is perhaps for another book. But going forward also would have implied a narrative of continuity from the Enlightenment to the present. Well, of course, there is such continuity. There is for every epoch in the past. But I think when you go down that road, you're in great danger of taking a presentist view of the Enlightenment, which is what I very much wanted to guard against. I tried to look at Enlightenment texts for what they told me. And what they told me was often quite different from what common assumption about the Enlightenment say. In particular, something that Tony drew attention to, the centrality of religion in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was about religion, I think more than anything else, including the possibility of religion promoting happiness and the strong likelihood of religion creating unhappiness. I handled the concept of secularization very much with kid gloves. I don't think it fits very well. This attempt to get close to the Enlightenment. Now, I'm fully aware of the difficulties of getting close to the past. But nevertheless, I think that in certain ways it can be done. This helps to explain the number of things that I leave out. As Tony rightly pointed out, there is no postmodernism. There's only one mention of Foucault. There's a bit about Habermas. In fact, I had quite a lot about Habermas, arguing with him and maintaining that the English translation has led to his being misunderstood. But the editor made me cut that out as of too academic interest. I also avoid the word, I announced this in the preface, I avoid the words Eurocentrism, Orientalism, and also modernity. Why? First of all, I don't want to engage in long arguments with a large number of well-known names. Second, the use of these terms always carries with it a large amount of baggage, a large number of ready-made assumptions, which would be very laborious to contest. Rather than that, I bypass all these things and try to get back to the Enlightenment to some degree as it was, and I hope that I've succeeded. The statement by Ranke, the historian should tell the past wie es eigentlich gewesen, as it really was, is constantly misunderstood. Ranke didn't mean you can get right up to the reality of the past. Of course you can't. It's always multiply mediated. What he meant was that the historian shouldn't use the past for preaching sermons or uttering moral and political doctrines relevant to the present. If you look him up in the original context, that's what he's saying. And that was part of my negative ambitions. Have I time to say anything else? Yes, okay. Yes, I have presented a Europe-wide Enlightenment. Originally, I meant to give roughly equal weight to Scotland, England, France, and Germany. I was very glad that my editor allowed me to keep a sub-chapter title, At Long Last, An English Enlightenment. I think that the idea of national enlightenments ought to be set aside. When you think how much literature circulated in translation, how language wasn't a barrier to intellectual diffusion, then I think one should see the Enlightenment as a pan-European phenomenon, taking in early America as well. And therefore, rather than talking about, for example, the German Enlightenment or the Scottish Enlightenment, I would rather say the Enlightenment in Germany, etc. I rather wish I'd rewrite the book along those lines. Now, one problem, which I think I don't think has quite been brought out so far, which I'm conscious of, is the boundaries of the Enlightenment. it's very easy, and I rather suspect I may have done so, to make the Enlightenment coextensive with the 18th century. And I've certainly given a lot of space to figures who, in some respects, seem strange bedfellows of the Enlightenment, like Samuel Johnson. But I can quote in my defense an article with the late Robert Shackleton, treating Johnson as an enlightener. But also, when did the Enlightenment begin and end? My boundaries are not entirely arbitrary. I begin in the 1680s, the decade of Newton's Principia, of the Glorious Revolution, and, more important for my purposes in some ways, the beginning of the work of Pierre Bayle. But where does it end? In the late 18th century, you got a very large, fuzzy, indefinable area. In French, it's called Pré-Romantisme. In German, it's called Spätaufklärung. What I've essentially done is try to annex this area for the Enlightenment under the title Late Enlightenment. But there are many figures who don't fit in to these schemes at all, who don't fit in either to Enlightenment or Romanticism. For example, the very popular and prolific clerical writer Johann Caspar Lavater, an unclassifiable figure. Or a recent book discusses Blake and Hamann as figures who don't fit into conventional schemes. And it makes very good arguments. So for me, the late 18th century is an area of fascination, an area that doesn't fit into a neat pattern, and one place where I'd like to do more work. And just finally, I'm grateful to Tony for mentioning Wieland, an enormously prolific and enjoyable writer who is absolutely central to the Enlightenment in Germany and was called in his day the German Voltaire, a figure who I've also written about. As for going on, the idea of going on writing about Romanticism and liberalism is beyond my powers and also contrary to my inclinations. I'm at the moment writing a small book about Nietzsche, who very often praises the Enlightenment and claims to be continuing its work. That's a claim that demands investigation. He dedicated one of his books to Voltaire. And after his publication, an unknown hand sent him from Paris a bust of Voltaire with the message, "The shade of Monsieur de Voltaire presents his compliments to Monsieur Nietzsche." And in fact, the late 19th century attracts me very much, but since I retire from my job in 8 months' time, I may possibly be able to pursue it. So once again, thanks to all the speakers, and I'm very happy now to respond to questions as best I can. And just I've got the chat function on, but I don't see any chat yet.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ritchie. We now indeed welcome questions from members of the audience. We have received a few, but perhaps I should abuse the chair's privilege and raise an issue that has been in the news for quite some time, and that's the relationship between Enlightenment and racism, treatment of non-European cultures. I mean, you mentioned it in your preface, Ritchie, by reference to David Hume, whose name has just been removed by the University of Edinburgh from one of its buildings. And of course, there are similar debates about Kant and racism and so on. How do we deal with this sort of criticism? And should we vindicate the Enlightenment as a movement without many of its authors? How would you go about it?
Well, one answer is, I do talk about these remarks by Hume and Kant, and I don't whitewash them at all. They are absolutely unacceptable. But we don't throw Hume overboard, because he wrote and persisted in reprinting, by the way, one undoubtedly racist footnote, for which his contemporaries rebuked him. He wasn't expressing a general view. The remarks by Kant, which I quote, are, if anything, worse, and indeed childish. But as was pointed out earlier, Kant is a problematic presence in my book. In some respects, he does bring Enlightenment debates to a head, but he goes off in new directions. But to come back to race, well, first of all, we don't throw Hume and Kant overboard because of some unacceptable sentences, and we don't condemn the Enlightenment as a whole for them. We have to look at what Enlightenment writers said, and we also have to look at the actual treatment of Africans, to take a salient example, in the Enlightenment. Now, the slave trade was in full swing, and it was, to many people, it was acceptable in a way that seems astonishing now. For example, John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace, admits in his autobiography that it was a bit disagreeable to be so much occupied with chains and fetters. But the reason why he underwent a conversion was not that he was ashamed of being a slaver, but he was ashamed of drinking and debauchery. But those Africans who made it to Europe and freedom, in some cases, rose to heights. Everyone knows about the great-grandfather of Alexander Pushkin, an African who became an engineer. Not everyone knows about Wilhelm Amo, the black philosopher of Halle, who was a professor and published books on philosophy, one of which I've read, though I'm afraid the philosophy was a bit beyond me. We don't know enough about Ignacio Sancho, another freed slave, who figured in London literary life in the late 18th century, corresponded with Lawrence Sterne, and had his portrait painted by Joshua Reynolds. And Olaudah Equiano, whose autobiography, called The Interesting Narrative, fully deserves its name, is not yet a household word. So we have to be differentiated. We have to look at the trees and not settle for a superficial and present-minded description of the wood. Let me leave it there.
Yep. Okay, thank you, Ritchie. And we have two questions concerning geography. So one member of the audience asks, to what extent is your periodization, the period between 1680 to 1790, dependent on your geography? And another asks, would a different geography of the Enlightenment yield a different chronology, which, for instance, does not come to an end with the French Revolution?
It's difficult to answer the latter question, because I don't quite see what the alternative is. But the second question, if one took it, well, a different chronology would make the Enlightenment look a good deal different. For example, take the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. That was only barely getting off the ground in the 1780s. It flourished throughout the 19th century, throughout which enlightened teachers called masculine sought to bring Western knowledge and culture to traditional Jewish communities. So that would be quite a big difference. And I think what spread was net more widely. Areas of the world that don't appear or barely appear in my book will become much more prominent. For example, South America. On geography, I haven't gone at all into the question of whether the term Enlightenment is appropriate to other cultures such as India, China, or Japan. That is simply my ignorance. But another reason for being hesitant about attempting it is that I'm not sure that it would be right. I think it probably wouldn't be right to use the history of Western Europe as a model or template for other parts of the world and try to accommodate them to it. So I think along those lines, there's certainly a lot of investigation and rethinking to be done.
Okay, thank you. There are two questions about the topic of Karen's comment, happiness. And one member of the audience asks, if there is an Enlightenment right to happiness and its pursuit, is there also a moral obligation or a duty to provide it? An Enlightenment duty to be happy or to care for someone's happiness? The other question is whether Enlightenment pursuits of happiness could have affected expectations and experiences of family life. For example, different ideas of marriage or practices also.
Two good questions. I don't think that, I'm not aware that people talked about a duty to be happy. Rather, they felt that personal happiness, individual happiness, was a rather rare state, and you were lucky if you got it. I've often thought of the terrifying parenthesis in Hume for happiness is not to be dreamed of. Now, what the Enlighteners were concerned about was much more public happiness, the preconditions for individual happiness, which a just and effective ruler could create. Family life, yes. Well, it's striking how many Enlightenment thinkers were not married, or else had disastrous family lives. Rousseau is a cardinal example, but you can't imagine Hume or Kant married. I think that the heyday of family life as an ideal comes in the 19th century, in which you have the separation of spheres, the male sphere of activity and the female sphere of homemaking. And the idea is that the family is a home, a refuge, in which the wife does not work, but looks after the children and creates a happy and affectionate environment. Schiller has that, and in fact, I think I may quote it in his poem Das Lied von der Glocke, the Song of the Bell, in which the man must go out and struggle and fight in the world, and the modest housewife, that's his phrase, stays at home and looks after the children. That's the that was a very much quoted and influential definition of the role of separate spheres, or what were biologized in Germany into Geschlechtscharaktere, sexual characters. So yes, family life, but much more in the 19th century than in the 18th.
Okay, and still on the topic of happiness, to what extent could the concept of happiness, especially aggregate happiness, collective happiness, to what extent could it be abused in the Enlightenment? So one of our members of the audience asked whether absolute rulers used the concept of aggregate happiness to justify despotism.
Yes, but they did. But despotism or absolutism was not tyranny, not absolute rule for its own sake, but a way of getting things done. I think we want to put aside a bit the negative connotations of despotism. A lot of Enlightenment thinkers saw despotism as something neutral. It could be used badly, and often was, but it could also be used well. It depended who was on the throne and what kind of purposes he, or in famous instances, she had.
Tony, do you want to come in with a question or comment? Can you unmute, please, Tony? We cannot hear you, Tony.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Now we can hear.
Okay. I would suggest that this issue of happiness is very closely connected with the issue of paternalism. Kant has a startling statement in which he says that the government cannot decide how people should be happy and should not make them be happy in the way it wants. And that is a direct rejection of paternalistic government. And to me, it's of immense importance because we're talking about an immensely paternalistic society. Particularly in not only in family life, but in patron-client relationships. The patrons, the model for the patron was the father. And there's a huge amount of work to be done, I think, on how the new expectations of happiness could be reconciled with the subordination and the need to demonstrate deference that paternalism in so many walks of life in the old regime required.
Mm-hmm. Karen, Joe, do you want to say something about happiness and paternalist government? I know that Joe did some work on such topics. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think what I was trying to say, though, is, and one could think of Joseph II through this lens, I think particularly that there's a kind of removal of cruel and coercive practice, that I don't think any enlightener, even an enlightened ruler, would necessarily name paternalism. You know, abolition of torture, reform of certain kinds of forced labor practices, etc., etc. That is a feature of Enlightenment and a very strong feature of Ritchie's book and of a kind of practical approach to administrative reforms below the level of the ruler. And I don't know that one would describe that as paternalistic, but I think one would describe that as enlightened by any yardstick. It's just that it was always an incomplete project. And then there were, as in the case of Joseph II and many other rulers, pet reform paternalistic projects that generated an equal and opposite reaction in their subjects. And you know, the one that always gets cited is Peter the Great and beards, and you know, that sort of that kind of line that gets crossed between the, you know, removal of constraints on people's bodily and social flourishing and active social interference. And I think only in the late Enlightenment are people beginning to feel their way through a kind of utilitarian lens through the boundary between those two kinds of things. But Joe understands far better than I do what that might have meant in practice.
Yes, well, I'm not sure what I understand, but I suppose I would say three things about happiness. I mean, my interest in this comes from a book that I edited recently, a Festra for Paul Slack, on suffering and happiness in England from the 16th to the 19th century. And I'd say three things coming out of that. And one is we tell in different chapters in that book a long-term story, which is partly a linguistic story. It's about how in the 16th and 17th centuries, the word happiness bundles together all sorts of things which used to be described by a series of distinct words. So it's become an extremely loose and baggy concept by the 18th century, in a way quite hard to think with. And the idea that governments should promote happiness is, I think, to most people in the 18th century, really not a very contentious statement. It's Aristotle, after all, it's true by definition. That's what government is for. It's not the only way of thinking about what government's for, but it's a very standard way of thinking about what government's for. And I agree with Karen, I think in the late 18th century, that's becoming a bit complicated, because ideas about autonomy and the value of autonomy, sense that maybe actually autonomy is an important component of personal satisfaction, beginning to come visibly into tension with these more top-down notions. I'm not sure paternalistic is a term of the time, so I think it's actually a product of the 19th century skepticism about this construct of the ruler or the superior promoting happiness. So I do think the unpacking happiness and looking at how it's in a critical dialogue with conceptions of good rule in the late 18th century is an interesting project that more could be done with.
Yes, Nicholas Cronk has a question.
I was really just replying to Joe. Joe just mentioned Paul Slack, and that made me think about his recent work on the notion of improvement. And he unpacked the word improvement actually in the 17th century. But what he describes is actually quite like what you could call a sort of pre-Enlightenment. So in a sense, it's another example of sort of pragmatic happiness, really, isn't it? Another thread that comes into the 18th century. And Paul Slack actually talked about his book to our seminar a year or so back when we used to meet across the table. And he mentioned lots of sources when he talked about the English term improvement. And I went and looked at them afterwards, and these were sources that were read by, for example, French philosophes. So there's another thread there. So there's a pragmatic, social, utilitarian sort of happiness that comes out of what Paul calls improvement, I think.
Mm-hmm.
May I come back in for a moment?
Yeah, Ritchie. Yeah.
Harking back to Tony, Kant is very important here, which he does denounce the concept of paternalism. I forget what exact word he uses, and paternalism certainly did exist in the 18th century, where in Germany the ruler of each of the 300 or so principalities was the Landesvater, and the father of the country, and the populace was supposed to be in a state of childlike obedience. That's what Kant has in mind when he makes that sharp comment, and what one does sympathize. May I also say that I very much wish that I had thought of the concept of negative and positive happiness, which Karen coined, modeled as I Berlin, and if I return to the subject, I will certainly borrow it.
Okay, well, if this discussion could help in some ways, there is a very interesting question here about the self-identification of the enlightener, the Aufklärer, as engaged in a project of enlightenment, especially in Germany, of course. Kant's Was ist Aufklärung, Moses Mendelssohn's very similar essay. So did this self-identification of authors as enlightenment authors differentiate them or solidify the Enlightenment in a way that distinguished it from Romanticism?
I'm supposed to answer that. I think that is not where I would draw the boundary between the Enlightenment and quote-unquote Romanticism. And the concept of the Enlightenment project is used especially by critics of the Enlightenment. Alistair MacIntyre comes to mind. Historians very much object to it because it imposes a false unity on the endeavours of the Enlighteners. Nevertheless, I think if you take the polemic away, the concept of an Enlightenment project, a broad similarity among the positive endeavours of the Enlighteners, is of some value. So I wouldn't entirely throw it overboard.
Okay, thank you very much, Ritchie. I think we have to draw to a close. It's already 6:30, at least in the UK. But we will do so only after reminding you first that we have several sessions this term in the Enlightenment Workshop about new publications in Enlightenment studies, and you're all welcome to join us for these discussions. The next meeting is in 2 weeks' time, and we shall be discussing Antoine Lilti's recent book on the legacies of the Enlightenment. So that might actually answer some of the questions about the 19th century and so on, and where do we go from the French Revolution onwards. Nicholas Cronk, the co-convener, would like also to say a few things at the end of this session.
Well, so I just want to echo Avi and to say thank you very much to Ritchie for such a, first of all, writing such a wonderful book that launched our seminar program this term. And thank you very much to Karen, to Joe, and to Tony for all the work you put in stimulating the discussion. It was absolutely fascinating. And thank you. Happy New Year, everyone. It's not too late to say that, at least in France. And we'll look forward to seeing you in a fortnight's time. We gather from Torch that we have a record number of people attending, so that's already very exciting. So also we should finish off saying thank you to Torch for helping make today's session possible, and we'll see you in a fortnight. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, thanks a lot to our discussants, Tony Lavopa, Joe Innes, Karen O'Brien, and most of all to Ritchie Robertson. Thank you. Good evening.